The worn polyester of her uniform felt like a second skin, a humble armor against a world that rarely offered more than indifference. Ilara traced the rim of a water glass, polishing away a non-existent smudge for the third time. From her vantage point behind the polished mahogany bar of the Gilded Sparrow, she had a clear view of Liam Blackwood as he walked in, his smile cutting through the dim, expensive lighting of the restaurant. He was like a character from a different story, one where the pages were glossy and the ink never ran. His world was one of inherited prestige, of sprawling estates with names, not numbers, and of a future as secure as the gold in his family's vaults. Her world was one of shared apartments, bus schedules, and a future that was a hand-drawn map with more questions than destinations. Yet for the past 6 months, their worlds had collided in the most beautiful, improbable way. He saw past the apron and the tired eyes. He saw her. He listened to her dreams of one day opening a small bakery, not with the condescending air of a benefactor, but with the genuine interest of a partner. Tonight was different, though. A knot of anxiety had been tightening in her stomach since he'd called 2 days ago. "Dinner," he'd said, his voice bright with an excitement she couldn't share. "At my family's home, Blackwood Manor. I want them to finally meet the woman I love." Blackwood Manor. The name alone was a legend in the city, a Gothic revival masterpiece perched on the highest hill, overlooking the lesser mortals below. It was the heart of the Blackwood dynasty, a family whose name was etched onto university halls and hospital wings, a name synonymous with old money and unshakable power. And she, Ilara, a waitress who bought her clothes from thrift stores, was going to walk through its doors. "You're a million miles away," Liam's voice was warm beside her, jolting her from her reverie. He slid onto a bar stool, his tailored suit a stark contrast to her simple black uniform. "Just a few," she smiled, her heart doing a familiar flutter, thinking about tonight. "Don't be nervous," he said, taking her hand. His was warm and steady. "They're going to love you. Just be yourself." But that was the problem. Who was herself? Was she the woman who could flawlessly recall a 12-tops order under pressure, or the girl who still had nightmares about a past she'd buried so deep it felt like it belonged to someone else? For Liam, she was Ilara, a simple, sweet girl with a kind heart. It was a comfortable role, a safe one, but she feared that to the Blackwoods, simple would just be another word for unworthy. She had spent her last $60 on a dress, a simple, elegant navy blue sheath she'd found at a consignment shop. It was modest, tasteful, and she hoped invisible. Her goal for the evening was not to impress, but to survive. To get through the dinner without giving the formidable Blackwood family any reason to validate the prejudices she was sure they already held. Later that evening, as Liam's luxury sedan purred through the immense wrought-iron gates, the sheer scale of Blackwood Manor stole her breath. It wasn't a house, it was a declaration. Stone lions guarded the entrance, their faces weathered into permanent snarls. Each window was a dark, watchful eye. As they pulled up the sweeping gravel driveway, the massive oak doors swung open as if by magic, revealing a butler who looked older and more dignified than any man she had ever met. "Liam, darling, you're late." A voice like chilled champagne echoed from the cavernous foyer. A woman glided towards them, impossibly elegant in a silk gown, her silver hair coiled perfectly. This was Eleanor Blackwood, the matriarch. Her eyes, the same piercing blue as her son's, swept over Ilara, and in that single fleeting glance, Ilara felt she had been weighed, measured, and found wanting. "Mother, this is Ilara," Liam said, his hand finding the small of her back. "Ilara, my mother, Eleanor." "A pleasure," Ilara said, her voice barely a whisper. "Charmed," Eleanor replied, the word utterly devoid of charm. Her gaze lingered for a second too long on the simple fabric of Ilara's dress before she turned. "Richard is in the study. Chloe is just coming down. Do try to keep up." The evening unfolded like a slow, beautifully orchestrated execution. The foyer led into a grand hall where portraits of stern-faced Blackwoods stared down from the walls, their painted eyes following her every move. Richard Blackwood, Liam's father, was a titan of a man with a booming voice and a handshake that felt more like a test of strength. He sized her up with the overt appraisal of a man buying livestock, asking pointed questions about her background and prospects that were thinly veiled insults. Then there was Chloe, Liam's younger sister. She was a younger, sharper version of her mother, her smile a weapon she wielded with precision. She circled Ilara, her compliments laced with poison. "What a quaint dress," she'd said, touching the fabric between her thumb and forefinger as if it were contaminated. "It's so brave of you to be so minimalist." Ilara tried to hold her own. She answered their questions politely, kept her back straight, and focused on Liam, who seemed oblivious to the undercurrents of hostility. He beamed, proud to have her there, squeezing her hand under the table as if they were all the best of friends. He didn't see the way his mother's lip curled when Ilara used the wrong fork for the salad, or the way his father dismissed her opinion on a current event with a condescending chuckle. He saw what he wanted to see, his family and the woman he loved together. The dining room was a museum of wealth. A crystal chandelier the size of a small car hung over a table that could have seated 30. The air was thick with the scent of roasted duck and old money. Ilara felt like an intruder, a field mouse at a banquet of lions. The conversation was a minefield. They spoke of yachting in Monaco, of art auctions at Sotheby's, of charity galas where the donation for a single plate could have paid Ilara's rent for a year. She remained silent, knowing any contribution she could make would only highlight the chasm between their worlds. "So, Ilara," Chloe said, her voice slicing through the clinking of silverware. "Liam tells us you work at the Gilded Sparrow. You must have some fascinating stories, all the interesting people you must serve." The word serve was hung in the air, weighted and deliberate. Before Ilara could formulate a response, Eleanor added, "It's noble work, of course, for some. We believe everyone has their place. It is the foundation of a stable society." The implication was clear. "And your place is not here." Ilara felt a familiar cold anger begin to simmer deep within her. It was an old friend, an emotion she had worked for years to suppress. She took a slow, steadying breath, reminding herself to stay calm. "For Liam." "I do meet a lot of people," Ilara said, her voice even. "I find that you can learn a lot about a person by the way they treat someone they believe is beneath them." A flicker of something, annoyance, respect, crossed Richard's face. Eleanor's smile tightened. Chloe, however, seemed to take it as a direct challenge. The main course was cleared, and the butler began to pour the wine, a deep, blood-red vintage from a dusty bottle. It was a Chateau Margaux, Richard announced with pomp, a wine older than Ilara herself. Chloe picked up her glass, but instead of drinking, she turned to her brother. "Liam, darling, you never did tell us how you two met. Was it a love-at-first-sight moment across a crowded room? Or did you just order the special and get more than you bargained for?" Liam laughed, missing the barb entirely. "It was at the restaurant. I couldn't take my eyes off her." "I can see why," Chloe purred, her eyes glinting. She stood holding her glass as if to make a toast. "She has a certain resilience. You have to be resilient in the service industry, don't you? Dealing with spills, difficult customers." She took a step, feigning a stumble on the priceless Persian rug. Time seemed to slow. Ilara saw the deliberate arch of her wrist, the calculated tilt of the glass. It was not an accident. It was an assault. The entire glass of dark, staining red wine cascaded down the front of Ilara's navy blue dress. It splashed across her chest and lap, a shocking, violent crimson against the dark fabric. The cold liquid soaked through instantly, clinging to her skin. A collective, theatrical gasp went around the table. "Oh my goodness," Chloe cried, her hand flying to her mouth in a perfect portrait of shock. "I am so dreadfully clumsy. Look what I've done. Your lovely dress. It's ruined." Richard Blackwood sighed with theatrical exasperation. "Chloe, for heaven's sake, be more careful. That was a 1982 Margaux." He didn't even look at Ilara. His concern was for the wasted wine. Eleanor clicked her tongue. "Don't worry, dear," she said to Ilara, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "We have staff for this sort of thing. I'm sure one of the maids has a uniform that will fit you. You can change in the staff quarters." The staff quarters. The suggestion was the final perfect twist of the knife. They weren't just insulting her. They were trying to put her back in her place, to physically dress her in the uniform of the servant they believed her to be. Liam was finally jolted into action. "Mother, Chloe, it was an accident." He turned to Ilara, his face a mess of confusion and concern. "Ilara, are you okay? We can get that cleaned." But Ilara wasn't listening. She was looking at the dark red stain spreading across her chest. It looked like a wound. And in that moment, something inside her broke. Not her spirit, not her composure, but the lock on a door she had kept sealed for a decade. The quiet, unassuming waitress named Ilara began to recede, and from the depths another woman began to emerge. A woman forged in betrayal and tempered by a singular burning purpose. She looked up from the stain, her eyes no longer soft and nervous, but chillingly calm and clear. A slow, faint smile touched her lips. It was a smile that did not reach her eyes, and it made the blood run cold in Chloe's veins. The room fell silent, waiting for the tears, the outburst, the humiliated retreat. None of it came. Ilara simply stood, the ruined dress clinging to her, and looked at each of them in turn. The lions in the cage had poked the wrong creature. They thought she was a field mouse. They were about to find out she was a dragon. The air in the grand dining room was thick with expectation. The Blackwoods, masters of their universe, anticipated a scene. They were connoisseurs of discomfort, particularly when they were the cause of it. They expected Ilara to burst into tears, to rush from the room in shame, or perhaps to lash out with clumsy, powerless anger. Any of these reactions would have affirmed their superiority and provided a satisfying end to their evening's entertainment. Liam, bless his naive heart, was fumbling with a napkin, dabbing uselessly at the massive stain on her dress. "Here, honey, maybe we can—" Ilara gently placed a hand on his, stopping him. Her touch was firm, her expression unreadable. "It's quite all right, Liam," she said, her voice startlingly steady. It was lower than before, stripped of its earlier deference. "It's just a dress." She looked directly at Chloe, whose feigned horror was beginning to curdle into confusion. "And you're right. Spills happen." Then she did something no one expected. She excused herself from the table, not with a mumbled apology or a hurried escape, but with the poise of a queen leaving her court. "If you'll excuse me for a moment," she said to the room at large, "I need to go to my car." "Your car?" Eleanor asked, her perfectly sculpted eyebrow arching in disdain. "The butler can call you a taxi if you're feeling unwell." "I'm not unwell, Eleanor," Ilara replied. The use of the matriarch's first name, so casual and devoid of its usual reverence, hung in the air like a discordant note. "I just need to retrieve my briefcase." A briefcase? The word seemed absurd. What could a waitress possibly have in a briefcase that was of any importance here? Richard Blackwood grunted, already dismissing her as he swirled the remaining wine in his glass. Liam looked utterly bewildered. "Ilara, what's going on?" "Just wait for me here," she said to him, her voice softer, but with an edge of command he'd never heard before. "Please." She walked out of the dining room, her back ramrod straight. The sound of her modest heels on the marble floor was the only sound, each click a sharp report in the sudden tense silence. She didn't go to the staff quarters. She walked straight out the massive front doors, past the stone lions, and into the cool night air. Her car, a 10-year-old sedan, looked pitifully out of place among the fleet of luxury vehicles parked in the circular driveway. But to her, it was a sanctuary, an armory. She opened the trunk. Inside, nestled next to a spare tire and a box of emergency flares, was a sleek black leather briefcase. She also pulled out a garment bag. She didn't change in some cramped bathroom. She used the spacious marble-clad powder room just off the main foyer, a room larger than her entire bedroom. She peeled off the wine-soaked dress, a symbol of the meek woman she had pretended to be, and dropped it into a wastebasket. From the garment bag, she withdrew a perfectly tailored suit of charcoal grey wool. The jacket was sharp-shouldered, the trousers impeccably creased. Beneath it, she wore a simple, elegant silk shell. Her hair, which had been in a soft, simple style, she pulled back into a severe, commanding knot at the nape of her neck. As she looked in the gilded mirror, the reflection was of a stranger. The soft, hesitant lines of Ilara the waitress were gone, replaced by the sharp, focused angles of a woman who meant business. The transformation was absolute. This was not a costume, this was her skin. The waitress uniform had been the disguise. Deep in the recesses of her memory, a voice echoed, her father's voice, warm and full of life. "Isabella, my little star," he would say, his hands smelling of graphite and paper. "Never forget that a person's true worth is not in their wallet, but in their integrity. And never ever let a bully win." Her name wasn't Ilara, it was Isabella Rossi. And her father, Marco Rossi, had been Richard Blackwood's partner. Marco was the artist, the architectural genius with a soul that dreamed in blueprints and steel. Richard was the salesman, the glad-handing moneyman with a soul that dreamed only in dollar signs. Together, they were supposed to build an empire. Blackwood Manor itself was her father's masterpiece. He had sketched it on napkins, built models from cardboard, and poured his very essence into its design. It was to be the flagship project of their shared company, Rossi and Blackwood. But Richard Blackwood had a different plan. With a series of cunning, predatory legal maneuvers, he had systematically squeezed Marco out, stealing the patents, the designs, and the contracts. He left his partner, his friend, with nothing but debt and a broken heart. The stress had destroyed Marco Rossi. A massive coronary took him at 52, leaving his 18-year-old daughter, Isabella, alone with a mountain of his partner's debts and a burning, all-consuming need for justice. The world saw a tragic bankruptcy. Isabella saw a murder, committed not with a weapon, but with a fountain pen and a forged signature. For 10 years she had been a ghost. She'd changed her name, taken on a series of low-profile, cash-based jobs, and lived a life of deliberate obscurity. She'd put herself through night school, earning degrees in finance and law, her focus as sharp as a shard of glass. The small inheritance her mother had left her, a sum the Blackwoods knew nothing about, she didn't spend. She invested it, nurtured it, and with a patience born of pure hatred, she waited. She learned everything about the Blackwoods. She learned of Richard's reckless investments, his addiction to high-risk ventures to fund their lavish lifestyle. She learned of the second and third mortgages on the manor, the private, high-interest loans taken out to cover stock market losses. And one by one, through a network of shell corporations and anonymous holding companies, she began to buy that debt. She became their silent, unseen creditor. Every lavish party they threw, every European vacation they took, pushed them deeper into her hands. Meeting Liam had not been part of the plan. It was a random, statistical anomaly. He'd come into the restaurant and he'd been kind. Genuinely kind. For a while, she'd allowed herself to wonder if he was different, if the son could be free of the father's sins. She had even foolishly fallen in love with the idea of him, with the idea of a different life. But tonight had shown her the truth. His kindness was a shallow pool. Faced with the casual cruelty of his family, he was weak, a product of the same rotten tree. His inaction was its own form of violence. The love, or whatever it had been, died in that splash of red wine. Briefcase in hand, Isabella Rossi walked back towards the dining room. The meekness was gone, replaced by a cold, righteous fury that had been simmering for a decade. She was no longer a guest in this house. She was its judge, its jury, and its executioner. The Blackwoods thought they had ruined her simple $60 dress. They had no idea she was about to unravel the priceless fabric of their entire existence. When Isabella re-entered the dining room, the change was so profound that for a moment no one spoke. It wasn't just the clothes, it was everything. The way she held her head, the confident, measured stride, the icy fire in her eyes. She looked like she belonged there more than they did. She looked like she owned the place. Liam stood up, his mouth slightly agape. "Ilara, what is this? What are you wearing?" "My name," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that silenced him, "is Isabella Rossi." She placed the briefcase on the magnificent mahogany table, the sharp click of the latches echoing in the stunned silence. Richard Blackwood, who had been looking bored and irritated, froze. His face, usually florid with expensive food and drink, began to drain of all color. The name Rossi had struck him like a physical blow. It was a ghost from a past he had worked very hard to bury. "Rossi," he stammered, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Marco Rossi's daughter." "The one and only," Isabella said, her eyes locking onto his. In her gaze he saw not the face of a young woman, but the ghost of the man he had betrayed. "I believe you knew my father." Eleanor looked back and forth between her husband and this transformed woman, her face a mask of confusion and dawning horror. "Richard, what is the meaning of this? Who is this person?" "She's a waitress," Chloe blurted out, trying to reclaim control of the situation. "She's playing some kind of ridiculous game." Isabella ignored her completely. Her focus was entirely on Richard. "A game? No, Chloe. This isn't a game. A game has winners and losers. This is a reckoning." She opened the briefcase. Inside, the documents were arranged in neat, damning stacks. She pulled out the first file and slid it across the polished table towards Richard. His hand trembled as he reached for it. "Let's start small," Isabella said, her tone conversational, as if discussing the weather. "These are the default notices on the loan for your villa in St. Bart's. You missed your third payment last Tuesday. The holding company that owns the loan, a rather aggressive little firm called Nemesis Acquisitions, has initiated foreclosure proceedings. The property will be seized at the end of the month." Richard stared at the papers, his breathing becoming ragged. "Nemesis Acquisitions. I've never heard of them." "I know," Isabella smiled faintly. "I founded it 6 years ago." She slid another file across the table. "This one might be more familiar. It's the debt on your collection of classic cars. You used them as collateral for a bridge loan to cover some unfortunate losses in the tech sector last quarter. That loan was sold. I bought it. As of 9 a.m. this morning, I own your precious Ferraris and your vintage Aston Martin." Chloe let out a small, strangled gasp. Eleanor looked as if she might faint. Liam just stood there, paralyzed, looking at the woman he thought he knew as if she were a complete stranger. "And this," Isabella continued, her voice dropping, becoming more intense, "this is the one that truly matters." She pulled out a thick, heavy stack of papers bound in a blue legal cover. It landed on the table with a soft, final thud. "This is the third mortgage on this house, on Blackwood Manor. A private loan you took out 5 years ago from a very discreet lender to prevent a hostile takeover of Blackwood Industries. You thought it was your secret lifeline. But your lender ran into his own trouble, and he was forced to sell his assets. I was a very motivated buyer." Richard looked up, his eyes wide with terror. "You can't. The payments are current." "They were," Isabella corrected him, "until last month. You see, the terms of that particular loan were rather draconian. There's a nasty little clause on page 47, subsection C. It states that if any of your other major assets enter into default, say a certain villa in St. Bart's, the entire principal of this loan becomes due. Immediately. All $12 million of it." She let the weight of her words settle in the suffocating silence. The Blackwoods were trapped, their opulent lives built on a foundation of debt and deceit, and she had just pulled the cornerstone. "You received the demand letter 2 weeks ago by courier. I have the signed receipt right here," she said, tapping a smaller envelope. "You probably gave it to some junior accountant who filed it away, assuming it was a mistake." "It wasn't." Eleanor finally found her voice, a shrill, cracking sound. "This is insane. You're a fraud. Richard, call security. Call our lawyer." "By all means," Isabella said calmly. "Call Jonathan Webb. He's a very good lawyer. I know because his firm has been on my payroll for the last 18 months. He's the one who vetted all these acquisitions for me. I assure you, every I is dotted, every T is crossed. This is all perfectly, ruthlessly legal, the same way my father's ruin was perfectly legal." The final devastating document came out of the briefcase. It was older, the paper thicker. It was the deed, the original deed to the property, transferred to her holding company as of this afternoon, after they had officially failed to meet the terms of the demand. "This house, this monument to your greed, was built from my father's dreams," she said, her voice thick with a decade of suppressed grief and anger. "He poured his soul into every line of the blueprints, while your husband, Richard, was busy writing the clauses that would steal it all from him. You didn't build this legacy, you stole it, and tonight, I'm just taking it back." She held up the deed, the legal instrument of their downfall. The Blackwood family stared at it, their faces a tableau of disbelief, rage, and utter despair. Their world, with its impenetrable walls of money and influence, had been dismantled from the inside out by a woman they had dismissed as a mere servant not 30 minutes earlier. The irony was so thick, so potent, it was almost poetic. They had spilled wine on her dress, a petty act of dominance, and in return she had just repossessed their entire lives. The shock in the room was a physical entity, a palpable, suffocating force. Richard Blackwood sank back into his chair, his face the color of ash. Eleanor's carefully constructed composure had shattered, leaving behind the raw, ugly face of panic. Chloe stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish, the architect of this immediate catastrophe unable to process the scale of her miscalculation. And Liam? Liam just stared at Isabella, his expression one of profound, heartbreaking betrayal. "Why?" he whispered, the single word cutting through the tension. "Ilara, Isabella, why would you do this? The last 6 months, was it all a lie?" Isabella's cold gaze settled on him, any trace of softness she might have felt for him now burned away. "A lie? Was it a lie when you watched your sister humiliate me? Was it a lie when you let your mother try to send me to the staff quarters? The lie, Liam, was the sweet, simple waitress you fell in love with. She never existed. I created her to get close to your family. You weren't the target, you were the key. The cost of admission. Each word was a perfectly aimed dart. My feelings for you were a complication, an unfortunate variable in a very precise equation. Tonight you helped me solve for it. You proved that when it mattered, you were a Blackwood first and a man second." The truth of her words struck him harder than any legal document could. He had been a pawn, a tool, and nothing more. He had failed the test, and in doing so had proven he was exactly what she needed him to be. Disposable. You little gutter snipe," Eleanor shrieked, her voice cracking with fury as she lunged to her feet. "You think you can just walk in here and take everything from us? This is our home, our legacy." "Your legacy is a lie," Isabella retorted, her voice like chipping ice. "It's built on a foundation of theft and a good man's heartbreak. This was never your home. You've just been squatting in my father's masterpiece for 20 years. This was the moment, the culmination of a decade of planning. From her jacket pocket, Isabella produced 2 items, a small, elegant silver lighter and a single magnificent Cuban cigar. It was a Cohiba Bahaiki, her father's absolute favorite. He had been smoking one the night Richard Blackwood had betrayed him. Isabella had kept this one in a humidor for 10 years, waiting for this exact moment. With deliberate, theatrical slowness, she began to roll the thick, valuable paper of the deed into a tight spill. "What are you doing?" Richard croaked, finding a sliver of his voice. "That's the original deed." "I know," Isabella said. "I have certified copies in a vault. This one is purely ceremonial." She flicked the silver lighter, the clean flame springing to life. She brought it to the edge of the rolled-up deed. The corner darkened, curled, and then caught, blossoming into a small, bright orange flame. The legal document that represented the sum total of the Blackwood family's identity was now a torch. Lifting the burning deed, she brought its flame to the tip of the Cuban cigar. She puffed gently, her eyes never leaving theirs, watching their reflections dance in her pupils as the fire grew. The end of the cigar glowed red as it caught. She drew in a long, slow mouthful of smoke that tasted of justice and sorrow. She held the cigar between her fingers and lowered the burning deed, letting it fall onto the priceless mahogany table. The flame licked at the polished wood before she calmly snuffed it out with the heel of her hand, leaving a blackened, scorched scar on the perfect surface, a permanent mark of her victory. She took another slow drag from the cigar, the grey smoke curling from her lips like a phantom. "It's mine now," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of an avalanche. "All of it." She gestured with the cigar towards the opulent room. "My security team is at the gate. You have 1 hour to pack a single bag each before they escort you out. They have a list of what you may take. It is not a long list." "Security?" Eleanor spat. "You can't do this." "I can," Isabella stated, "and just to ensure there's no misunderstanding," she added, a cruel glint in her eye, "I took the liberty of informing the city's major news outlets an hour ago." The press release was titled, "The Blackwood Facade, A Legacy of Fraud." "I attached copies of the foreclosure notices as a courtesy." They should be arriving any minute. I imagine the downfall of the Blackwood dynasty will make for a compelling story, don't you? Especially on the eve of your annual Foundation Gala. What a tragedy. The mention of the gala, the absolute pinnacle of their social calendar, was the final devastating blow. Their humiliation would not be private, it would be a public spectacle. As if on cue, the distant but unmistakable sound of news helicopters began to thrum in the night air, growing steadily louder. Chloe finally broke, letting out a wail of despair and running from the room. Richard, a broken man, pushed himself up from the table and walked numbly away. His empire turned to dust before his eyes. Eleanor shot Isabella one last look of pure venom before following her husband, their world collapsing around them. Liam was the last one remaining. "So that's it?" he asked, his voice hollow. "You just throw me away with the rest of them?" Isabella turned to face him fully, the cigar held loosely between two fingers. The smoke coiled around her, softening her sharp edges, making her look like an avenging spirit in the opulent gloom. "Throw you away? Liam, you were never mine to keep. You belong to them. To this name, to this house that was never yours to begin with." "But I loved you," he pleaded, taking a step forward. His face was a wreck of confusion and pain. "The Ilara I knew, she was real. I know she was. The way you laughed at my stupid jokes, the way you talked about wanting a bakery with a little blue door, that was real." "Was it?" she countered, her voice dangerously soft. "Or was it just good acting? Did you ever once, in all those months, ask me a real question? Did you ask about my family, about where I came from before I started serving you coffee? No, you saw a simple girl with a simple dream, and it was a comfortable fantasy for you. A little project. The rich boy saving the poor girl. It's a tale as old as time, and just as shallow." She took a step closer, invading his space. "I listened to you for hours. I know your childhood dog was named Chester. I know you hate cilantro. I know you dream of sailing around the world. What do you know about me, Liam? The real me?" He was silent, the answer a damning void between them. "Exactly," she whispered. "You loved a story you told yourself. I just provided the illustration." "I would have helped you," he said, his voice cracking, "if you had told me what my father did." "Helped me?" Isabella let out a short, bitter laugh. "You couldn't even help me when your sister was treating me like filth. You stood there, patting my hand, telling me it was an accident. You saw what you wanted to see. You are your father's son, Liam. You inherit his weakness just as surely as you inherited his money. You are a bystander in your own life." Her words were surgical, cutting away the last of his self-delusions. He stumbled back as if she had physically struck him. The whirring of the helicopters was louder now, a frantic heartbeat just outside the walls. Muffled shouts could be heard from the foyer. "Now go," she said, her voice turning back to steel. "Pack your bag. Your hour is almost up." He gave one last, searching look at the woman he had loved, but the kind eyes of Ilara were gone forever. In their place was the unyielding gaze of Isabella Rossi, a stranger who wore a familiar face. With a final shuddering sigh of defeat, he turned and walked away, a ghost leaving a house that was no longer his. Isabella stood alone in the vast, silent room. She had won. The silence that followed was heavier than the shouting had been. Victory felt cold, hollow. She looked at the smouldering cigar, the ashes of the deed on the table, the empty chairs. The ghosts of her past were exorcised, but she was now alone with them. From the grand foyer came a commotion. Eleanor's voice, shrill and imperious. "Take your hands off me. Do you have any idea who I am?" A calm, deep voice replied, "Yes, ma'am, we do. Please come with us." Isabella walked to the arched doorway of the dining room and watched. Two uniformed security officers, men who now worked for her, were escorting Eleanor and a catatonic Richard toward the door. Eleanor struggled, her silk dress twisting, her face a mask of fury. Richard simply stared ahead, his eyes vacant. Chloe followed, weeping hysterically, clutching a small designer handbag as if it were a life raft. As the massive oak doors swung open, a blinding wall of camera flashes erupted. The press had arrived. They swarmed forward, a pack of wolves sensing blood, shouting questions. their lenses like 100 accusing eyes. The Blackwoods, who had curated their public image with meticulous care for generations, were now stripped bare, their downfall broadcast for the world to see. Isabella watched them flinch, watched Eleanor shield her face, watched Richard stumble on the steps. It was a brutal public execution, just as she had planned. Liam was the last to emerge, his face pale in the strobe-like flashes. He looked up, his eyes finding hers in the darkened window for a single fleeting moment before he was swallowed by the crowd. She felt a flicker of something, but it wasn't satisfaction. It was just an ending. She turned away from the spectacle and walked back into the dining room. A soft cough broke the stillness. The elderly butler, Arthur, stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. He had been a silent witness to the entire evening. "Will you be requiring anything else, Miss Rossi?" he asked, his voice steady, the name change seamless. "No, Arthur, thank you," she said, her voice weary. He stepped into the room, his posture as formal as ever, but his eyes held a warmth she hadn't seen before. "Mr. Rossi hired me when this house was just a blueprint and a patch of dirt," he said softly. "He was a good man, the best I ever worked for. He used to say this room had perfect acoustics for laughter. I haven't heard much of it in 20 years. Arthur paused, his gaze thoughtful. "I stayed on after he was gone, because I felt I owed it to him. And to you." Isabella stared at him, understanding dawning. "You. The quarterly financial reports you received for the last 8 years were far more detailed than the ones Mr. Blackwood saw," Arthur confirmed with a slight nod. "A misplaced document here, a misfiled loan agreement there. I made sure that certain incriminating papers always found their way to the top of the shredding pile, while others found their way into a very secure postal box addressed to a Miss Ilara Vance. He never noticed. He was too arrogant to believe his own staff would ever be disloyal. Small things. But I had a feeling someone, someday, might find them useful. He was her secret ally, the ghost within the walls who had helped her arm herself for this very night." From his waistcoat pocket, he produced a small, worn object, a silver drafting pencil, its lead worn down. "This was his," Arthur said, holding it out to her. "He left it on his desk the last day he was here. He was heartbroken. He forgot it. I kept it for you." Isabella took the pencil, its familiar weight a comfort in her palm. It felt more real, more valuable than the entire mansion around her. A single hot tear escaped her eye, tracing a path down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness or joy, but of release. A decade of coiled tension finally undone. The weight of vengeance was heavier than she had ever imagined, and for the first time in years she felt it lift. "My pleasure in assisting you is only the beginning, Miss Rossi," Arthur said, his voice dropping slightly. "There is one more thing. Your father, he was a meticulous man. He suspected Mr. Blackwood's duplicity long before the end. He kept a private journal. From a hidden pocket inside his jacket, Arthur produced a simple, dark green leather-bound book, its corners soft with age. He gave it to me for safekeeping the week before he died. He said, 'If anything happens to me, Arthur, hold on to this. My Isabella will know what to do with it one day.' I have kept it safe ever since." Isabella took the journal with a trembling hand. It felt warm, alive. She opened it to a random page. Her father's familiar, elegant script filled the page, detailing a conversation with Richard, dates and figures circled, notes in the margins about stolen design elements and falsified invoices. It wasn't just a diary, it was a ledger of betrayal. It was the evidence that elevated this from a financial coup to a criminal conspiracy. The district attorney would have a field day with it. Richard Blackwood wasn't just losing his house, he was about to lose his freedom. She looked from the journal in her hand to the flashing lights outside. The public humiliation was a passing storm. This journal was a life sentence. Through the grand window, she could see the last of the chaos. The Blackwood family, bundled unceremoniously into the back of a black car that was definitely not one of their own, sped away down the gravel drive, pursued by news vans like sharks after a bleeding seal. The story of their fall would lead the morning news cycle, their name forever stained. The Blackwood name would be a ruin by sunrise, The Rossi name, however, was about to be rebuilt. She walked over to the grand fireplace and looked up at the portrait of a stern-faced Blackwood ancestor, his painted eyes seeming to glare down at her with impotent rage. "Arthur," she said, her voice clear and strong, the weariness replaced by a nascent resolve. "I want every portrait of a Blackwood removed from these walls by sunrise, and the tapestries, and these ridiculous suits of armor. We're going to let the light in." "It will be my distinct pleasure, Miss Rossi," he said, a genuine smile finally gracing his lips. Isabella turned the pencil over in her fingers. The dream of the bakery with the blue door felt like it belonged to another lifetime, a small, gentle dream born of a desire for a life she could never have. But maybe it wasn't a lie, maybe it was just a seed. Here, in this grand, empty house, she had acres of land to plant it in. She could build a dozen bakeries, she could build anything. "And Arthur," she said, turning back to him, her eyes shining with a new creative fire that had been long dormant. "Find me the original blueprints for this house. My father's blueprints." She looked around the cavernous room, no longer seeing it as a conquered fortress, but as a canvas. This house has been a tomb for 20 years. It's time it remembered how to be a home.